Five Nights at Freddy's is a series with admittedly very few known characters. There's the Aftons, the Emilys, and we know some of the names of William's victims, but that's pretty much it until Security Breach, and even then we get like 3 new named characters. It's because of this and other solid evidence that many people assume that we play as Michael Afton in pretty much every FNAF game, and that does make the most sense in my opinion. He is the main protagonist of the series, a tragic character with a knowable backstory that rises against the evil of his father, a tale as old as time. But what if I put forward that Michael wasn't the only protagonist? Instead, there's been someone lurking in the shadows since the beginning, hunting down William Afton, protecting the children at all costs, and sometimes even helping Michael Afton. Well, that's what we're here today to discuss. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. So who is this mystery person? Well, I believe it to be Charlotte Emily, and before we begin to speculate anything, we really should go over everything we definitively know about this person. Any canon information about Charlotte, which admittedly outside of FNAF 6 there isn't much. But that game does give us some information that we can work with to learn even more about her. So what do I mean by this? The first time Charlotte Emily is directly referenced in-game is Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator, or FNAF 6, where the unnamed man that communicates to us via cassette tapes mentions his daughter was killed by William Afton. Now we'll go into the books and what they tell us later on, but for the sake of clarity and so I don't sound like a robot, it's worthwhile to note that most people believe this pair of characters are named Henry Emily and Charlotte Emily respectively, based off of the characters from the books who share a similar role. Charlotte's name, or Charlie for short, as far as I'm aware, has never once been actually in any game. The characters in a few of the games, most of them actually, but as far as her name goes, it's never specified, outside of the novels. Henry is a bit loose, where like, you could speculate that the log titled HRY223 means Henry 2023, but it's unclear. But for ease, I'll be referring to her as Charlotte Emily or Charlie moving forward. Again, we don't get much information about Charlotte in this game, but we do get reiterations and confirmations of previous speculations of the character. This game confirms that she was the character killed in Give Cake to the Children outside of a Fazbear restaurant. And then we get the huge bombshell, and this is the main piece of information we get in FNAF 6, essentially confirming that Charlotte possesses the marionette after she dies. And while she is the marionette, she shepherds and helps the other lost souls in this franchise. So although this game doesn't tell us too much directly about who Charlotte Emily is, telling us that she possesses the marionette allows us to then get more information about what she does if we look at what the puppet does throughout the rest of this franchise. So let's do that. Like I mentioned, Charlotte Emily is killed outside of a Fazbear restaurant that the security puppet was inside of. However, it's not definitive as to what Fazbear restaurant she was killed outside of. We don't know where the security puppet was originally slated to go. Some argue it has to be Freddy's because Fredbear's never had any signs of a marionette, so a puppet being inside Fredbear's doesn't make much sense, but that is speculation. Others argue that it has to be Fredbear's because the only meaningful shot we get inside the restaurant is a bear inside of a fairly sparse restaurant. The same basic layout we see in the daytime minigames of FNAF 4, which we know are at Fredbear's. And not to mention, in the books, Charlotte is kidnapped and killed within Fredbear's family diner. The book evidence is fairly solid, and I don't have a huge counter-argument against it. I do have a problem, however, with the layout design argument, being that this art style is intentionally simplistic. We get barely any details of the layout or look of the building with this shot. This looks like almost nothing, so I don't find it very compelling to say, oh, well, it looks like the same almost nothing as FNAF 4 and FNAF 6. In the same vein, should we presume that because of Foxy Go Go Go, the MCI actually happened between 2 rooms that have no exits? Now, I do personally lean for the location being Freddy's, mainly because I don't believe the puppet was at Fredbear's. But also, I think it would make a lot of sense that she would remain at the place she was killed. And why does that matter for this argument? Because the next thing we know is that the marionette helped the kids from the missing child incident to possess the original animatronics. Henry implies this in FNAF 6, and we get further implications from Give Gifts, Give Life, a minigame where we play as the puppet and give animatronic masks and presents to dead kids. We also know for a fact that the missing child incident had to have taken place at Freddy's, not Fredbear's. Not only does it say this directly in FNAF 1, but every other iteration of the missing child incident in the books and the film take place at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. So if Charlotte was around to help the children possess the animatronics after the missing child incident, then she would have been at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. So if she died at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, it makes a lot more sense for the reason why she's still around. And again, the location of Charlotte Emily's death is not definitive or confirmed. I just personally think it's most likely to be at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. After all, you could always argue that the puppet was at Fredbear's and that's when Charlotte possessed it, but after Fredbear's shut down, the marionette was moved to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and that's where she encountered the missing child incident. That's perfectly valid. It's just not my personal preference. We also know that she was trying to stop William Afton during the Dead Child incident, or the FNAF 2 massacre. Essentially, FNAF 2 shows us a minigame called Save Them, where we are Freddy being led by the puppet, and there's several dead bodies strewn about the FNAF 2 location. Eventually, we encounter William Afton, who attacks us, and we get the text, "You can't." During that minigame, we're being led by the marionette, so ostensibly, Charlotte knew what was going on when William was killing the kids at FNAF 2 and tried her best to stop us. We also know that she was at FNAF 3, and while her motives are unclear, there's a pretty good speculation as to why. There are frames you can get in the cameras that show the marionette in this hallway, and specifically the marionette with a reflection in the puddle below, implying that she's not a phantom puppet like we see in The Office. Now, again, we don't know why Charlotte is here, but it's a pretty safe assumption that she's looking for William Afton, just like Michael is. In FNAF 2, we get these in-between night cutscenes of the FNAF 1 animatronics looking amongst themselves from the perspective of Freddy, and on one of the nights, the puppet is in our face for the entire night. Many people, myself included, believe these minigames are dreams that Michael Afton is having. However, as we'll get into later, it's been confirmed in the FNAF world, at least in the books, that when a spirit is trying to reach out to somebody, they often implant memories and mess with their dreams. So it's very possible, if not likely, that these dreams are being imparted onto Michael by one of the missing child incident kids, possibly Charlotte, or possibly even Gabriel, the boy who is suspected to be inside of Freddy. Honestly, that makes a lot of sense to be that spirit, considering the main mechanic in FNAF 2 is putting on a Freddy mask. I wonder if that's why Gabriel is reaching out, if he is the one that is. I never thought about that before. Finally, and what I believe to be the most interesting thing about the marionette, the Ultimate Custom Night death lines. In UCN, when most animatronics kill you, you get a random of like 4 or 5 different quotes from that animatronic. And keep in mind, Ultimate Custom Night is ostensibly created by the vengeful spirit. It's not a real place, and these aren't real animatronics, so the death quotes are often just reflections of what the vengeful spirit is thinking. However, we know the vengeful spirit absolutely hates William Afton, and all of these death lines have some kind of vibe to them, which makes the marionette's voice lines very interesting.
The others are under my protection. The others are like animals, but I am very aware. I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore. I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way.
I think the ones specifically of note are the ones where she has to protect the others, and that the others are like animals, but she is very aware. This could just be a reflection of her role throughout the series, spoken by the vengeful spirit. But this also could be telling us that the marionette in this circumstance isn't actually being created by the vengeful spirit, but is instead checking in on both of them. Is the marionette one of the few actual spirits in this area? Further backing this up are the other 2 death lines. I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you, not anymore. And specifically, I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way. Again, the vengeful spirit definitely hates William Afton, so this voice line seems fairly merciful, something that Charlotte would be likely to say. But pay attention to that last bit, you need to stay out of my way. That would imply she's trying to actively do something during the time of Ultimate Custom Night, which again feels very present and in the moment, not something that the vengeful spirit would be saying to William Afton, especially not from the perspective of the vengeful spirit, because again, the whole reason Ultimate Custom Night is happening is to torture William, not to keep him out of the way. And that's pretty much everything we learn about the marionette and Charlotte in the games. So what do we know about her from the books? Well, honestly, for the purposes of this video, not much. Again, we do get her name and the name of her father in the books, which is incredibly important, but the entire Silver Eyes novel trilogy focuses on the story of Charlie growing up and eventually facing off and killing William Afton, losing her own life in the process. But again, That story focuses on the robotic recreation of Charlotte Emily made by Henry Emily after she's killed by William Afton, something that, as far as we're aware, has no evidence of happening inside the games. It's realistically a completely separate character, and what she does in the novel isn't necessarily helpful in knowing what she would do in the games. For example, in the novels, Charlotte loves robotics and is studying them at a collegiate level, which is really interesting now that she's following in Henry Emily's footsteps, but she's doing that in college, and in the games, she dies at like 5 years old or something. Ostensibly, all we know is that before she was killed, she was just a normal kid. So what other information can we add to the ingredient list of this theory? I think it's relevant to bring up some notes about Remnant, memories, and how they operate in the FNAF world. Mark doesn't though. Sticking with the Silver Eyes for the moment, in the fourth closet, the third book, Remnant is of central focus. When the character Carlton has Remnant injected into his heart, he goes fully unconscious, but instead of dying, his unconscious mind enters this sort of transient spiritual state, and he's able to see a child from the missing child incident. In this room, there are also floating pieces of paper that turn out to be ripped up drawings, and he helps that child's spirit collect these pieces and put them together. Each time they put a picture together, one of the spirits from the missing child incident reappears. All of this seems to be implying that these scraps of drawings are pockets of Remnant that Carlton and the other spirits can visualize and see in this weird spiritual realm. And when they collect enough Remnant of one drawing or of the same kind, then that child is able to rematerialize in this spiritual space, getting some of their memories back in the process. And only when all of that Remnant is collected and sorted is Carlton able to show them that William Afton is the one who killed them, giving their memories back to them. Because before then, they couldn't even remember that they were dead. They were just playing at the pizza place with their friend Rabbit. Another story doubles down on this idea of memories and the afterlife. Alone Together, one of the Tales in the Pizzaplex stories, follows a boy named Travis trying to figure out why a ghost keeps haunting him to create this box, until eventually he finds out the ghost boy was him. It was his memories that he was reaching out to because he is dead. But once he finds his remains, all of his memories come flooding back to him, and he suddenly remembers that he is dead, he is a ghost, and the grandma who talked to him is also a ghost. And suddenly he feels much more at peace. The book itself explicitly states, quote, "Most ghosts linger around the place they died, especially if their remains are undiscovered. They travel around the places that are familiar to them," which feels like as explicit as this franchise ever gets for how ghosts and the missing child incident could work in this world. This would explain why the missing child incident spirits are so lost and wandering, but Charlotte isn't. Her body is discovered immediately. She was left in the street. So with all of this in mind, what does Charlotte do in the FNAF story? What makes me so certain that she is as much of a protagonist as Michael Afton? Well, let's pop our mixture into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. For one reason or another, and I have my own thoughts on this, but it's not for today's theory, William Afton kills Charlotte Emily outside of a Fazbear restaurant. The security puppet meant to watch over the children arrives too late and she's already dead. But due to the rain, by the time it gets to her, it collapses onto her. It's in this moment where Charlotte possesses the marionette. And even though her body is found, she remains at the pizzeria out of fear and confusion. Alone Together never states that a ghost has to move on when their remains are found. It only specifies that it's difficult for a ghost to move on without it. After all, Travis's grandmother sticks around just to watch over Travis and watch her friends as they slowly join her. Charlotte most likely sticks around because she's just a kid. Sure, she might know that William Afton killed her, but from her perspective, she has no idea why her dad's friend would have done that to her, or what's going on now, and she probably just wants to see her father again. But as she remains at Freddy Fazbear's, something goes horribly wrong. One day, two children appear at the pizza place, but they're children that can see her. No one should be able to see or talk to her, but they do. She asks them if they've been killed as well, but they don't know what she's talking about. They're just here to play at Freddy's. So she worriedly keeps an eye on William Afton. Maybe he's doing it again. And sure enough, she sees him do it 3 more times to 3 more children, killing them and stuffing their bodies into animatronic suits. And soon after, 3 more spirits join them at the pizza place. Charlotte tries to break the news to these ghosts, but they're incredulous. Why would they be dead? They're playing at the pizza place. That doesn't make any sense. So she goes to prove it to them the only way she knows how, showing those spirits their remains in the animatronics. And once the kids see their own bodies, all of their memories come back. They know what's going on and what happened. But before before they can do anything about it, Freddy Fazbear's closes down. A while after, the FNAF 2 location opens up. The original suits are old and smelly and stinky and not really good for, using at a kid's place. So they're only used for parts at this point for the new animatronics, the toys. But when those workers took pieces from the original suits to use to repair the toys, they fragmented the spirits bound to the animatronics. One by one, the clear identities of these spirits split apart, and all that were left were aggressive beasts. This is why the withered suits and the toys are so aggressive. Neither half are sure what's going on.
The others are like animals, but I am very aware.
Luckily, they're only aggressive towards adults, and the children seem fine, but not for long. William commits the Dead Child incident, or as I referred to it earlier, the FNAF 2 massacre. In the minigame Save Them, there are several dead children strewn about the FNAF 2 location, and William Afton is just killing children and leaving them in the rooms he killed them. Charlotte wants to stop him, but doesn't know how, and tries to get help from Freddy, but he's too fragmented, he's not sure what's going on, so Charlotte has to lead him to William, but when they both get there, it's ineffective and William wins that fight. Luckily, since the bodies were left in the open, the children William killed move on, but the FNAF 2 location closes, and the toys are scrapped. Charlotte can't figure out where they've gone, and now half of these souls are just missing, but she at least remains with the original cast to try to snap them out of it. After all, the marionette isn't a toy, so she's able to remain with the original suits. But even with all of this effort, it's hard to get them to remember anything. With the toys gone, the pieces aren't in place anymore. Eventually, FNAF 1 opens up, and Charlotte is still trying to coax some kind of memory out of those children, but they just, again, mindlessly attack adults. They even lash out at Michael Afton, but Charlotte doesn't. She doesn't recognize him as a threat, and luckily, he's fired before he can disassemble any animatronics, so he doesn't become a threat. But then William shows up again. William, however, remembers what happened at the FNAF 2 location. It's why he's showing up again. Somehow those animatronics recognized him and tried to defend the children from him. You would want to study the animatronics this time, and he would need to blend in to do so. As much as he would prefer the old Spring Bonnie suit, it would need some serious renovation to be safe to get inside of. So for now, he goes to the back room and finds any other remaining animatronics, and finds his old purple Freddy suit. He puts it on, and he leads them into the same safe room, disassembling them one by one. Quick aside, I know the purple Freddy and Follow Me being William wearing a suit is a bit of a stretch, I get it. But I think this train of logic, paired with the Shadow Freddy suit from the film, and the mention in the same game, FNAF 3, of irrelevant costumes being used after the Springlock suits, and all the other examples we've had of different characters having animatronic suits in the books, I think it's plausible, okay? I get it, it's weird, I think it's plausible. Charlotte tries, but she's ultimately helpless to stop William. However, eventually the spirits stop William themselves, led by the Vengeful Spirit. Now that the suits had been broken and scattered apart in the same place, there wasn't anything to attach them or anchor them. And in that weird, semi-transient state, they were able to focus enough to get William killed. And it's here we see the FNAF 3 Happiest Day minigame. Charlotte tries once again to reach out to these lost souls, and in this state, they don't have all of their memories, but they're at least able to be found, and Charlotte reminds them as much as she can about what happened, eventually leading to a time where they can all move on. However, just like the character encyclopedia states, Charlotte recognizes that William is not gone yet, and she stays around to keep an eye on him. She continues to follow him even when he's taken and put into FNAF 3, trying anything to stop him, but is ultimately unsuccessful, and eventually she's captured by Lefty for the Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator. While there, her along with everyone else are burnt to the ground, and in that moment of fluidity and uncertainty, Charlotte once again goes for William. But once again, it's being handled by the Vengeful Spirit, but that is perfect.
I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way.
With William occupied, Charlotte realizes the rest of the souls of the missing child incident are here. The missing pieces have finally been found. Them, along with everyone else at this fire, need help moving on, and Charlotte's already done it before. So it's here where, with her previous experience and seeing what the Vengeful Spirit is able to create, she creates FNAF World, a little purgatory of her own, a place to help the wayward souls of the franchise find rest, and move on. But as far as what happens to Charlotte after that, I'm saving that for a dedicated video of the FNAF 6 fire and its aftermath. So for now, what do you think of my interpretation of what Charlotte does in the FNAF timeline? At least the first half. I made a joke last week about all the different theories that get floated around the FNAF fandom, especially some of the more obscure ones that have very specific names. And one of them that I'd never given much thought because I thought was impossible was Shatter Victim. It's a theory first posited by Cuban Fancy, and it's meant to explain what happens to the bite victim after the bite of 83. But after I read the week before, and there was some evidence that suggested that this theory may be true, I actually gave the theory a deep dive. And the more I've looked into the theory and compared it to what I found myself in the games, I actually really like it. Well, slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what is Shatter Victim? Well, typically on these videos, I like to define a theory and then find evidence for it along the way, but this theory is kind of a hard sell. So I think it'll be to the benefit of everybody, including the theory itself, to instead go over what evidence we do have about the crying child and then circle back to the theory. Or I guess if recent theories are true, the evidence we have about Dave Afton. Well, the majority of the information we know for sure about this kid comes from FNAF 4, specifically the minigames that you see in between the nights. They show us the lead up to what was at the time known as the Big Bite, according to the week before, but after the bite of 87 was then referred to as the bite of 83. A lot of the details from these minigames are not 100% confirmed, but the general swaths of what happens there is pretty certain. That being, Michael Afton and his friends picked on his younger brother, Dave, relentlessly for his fear of the animatronics. Now, Dave seems to have really liked the actual Freddy characters, but as far as the animatronics, he had this deep-seated fear, which was likely caused from him seeing something he wasn't supposed to. We have no inclination as to what he saw, but Fredbear at some point says, "Remember what you saw, you know what happens if he catches you." Eventually, the bullying from Michael escalates to a point where they hoist Dave up to give a kiss to the Fredbear animatronic, but they get too close and Dave's head goes inside of the mouth just as Fredbear's mouth closes, crushing Dave's skull and sending him to the hospital. We're fairly certain he goes to the hospital because of the IV bag, medicine, and flowers on the side of the table in FNAF 4. While he's in this unconscious state, we hear a few speakers. If the gray text is anything to go by, the first one being Michael, wondering if Dave can still hear him and apologizing. But then Fredbear begins to talk, and it says, "You're broken. We are still your friends. Do you believe that? I'm still here. I will put you back together." After this, a flatline is heard and it's presumed that Dave dies. And that's all we know directly about Dave from FNAF 4. But the crying child shows up several times throughout this franchise, albeit none as solid and clear as FNAF 4. So we'll go over all the other evidence throughout the franchise that might be pointing to the crying child, starting with the most likely and ending at the biggest stretch. First up being FNAF World. It seems fairly clear that the main point of FNAF World is to allow the crying child to move on and find peace. After all, the clock collecting playthrough of FNAF World begins and ends with a pair of eyes giving us instructions, and we're talked to by a glitchy Fredbear throughout it. And throughout this time, we hear things like we're leaving breadcrumbs for him, and something bad happened out there and it's affecting in here. Not to mention, the ending of the clock ending mirrors very well with the ending of the FNAF 4 minigames, to the point of having the same lines. So this feels very direct, and it seems like somebody is actively trying to put the crying child back together as was promised in FNAF 4. Because FNAF World is so closely related and linked to Dave Afton, we can, by association, add the Happiest Day minigames from FNAF 3. After all, whenever you collect a clock in FNAF World, you play a representation of one of the ways to access a Happiest Day minigame in FNAF 3. In FNAF 3, the Happiest Day minigames are a bit more detailed, where we play what seem to be arcade games that would have originally been found in the FNAF 2 location. But in each of them, we go out of bounds, seek out a crying child, and give them cake. Note I said a crying child, because if you only do one or some of these and then go to the Happiest Day minigame, there will be children wearing various Freddy's masks, but that's it. It's only when you collect all of the children in these minigames that when you go to the Happiest Day minigames, there's a fifth child on the other end of the table, to which you can give cake, he puts on a Fredbear mask, and then they all seemingly move on. It should be noted that twice now, we need to gather several things to help the crying child find peace. Moving on to more speculative evidence is the crying child's appearances within the security logbook. Most FNAF fans agree that the altered text speaker of this book is the crying child. After all, the red ink is definitely Mike, he says so, and the faded text is a lot more vague. But the altered text speaks in a way befitting of the crying child, saying things like "I'm scared" and "I can't see." Furthermore, whenever a question is asked of the altered text, it's created in a way that could work for the crying child, like this page where it asks if any of these toys are familiar, and one of them is the FNAF 4-bedroom phone. If the altered text in this book is the crying child, the thing that's useful for this theory is that it seems as though the crying child has lost nearly all of his memories by this point in the timeline, and he's not even sure what's going on anymore. And finally, most speculative is FNAF 1. Now, admittedly, this could be nothing. This could just be me losing my mind. But it's worth noting that one of the hallucinations in FNAF 1 is in this hallway, where all of the posters can change to a picture of a crying child. Now, this was probably made way before any of this was planned, so it was most likely meant to be like missing child incident shenanigans or whatever, but in retrospect, this might be important, almost as if the entire building is possessed by the crying child. So like I mentioned, throughout this franchise, at least twice after the crying child has died, it takes a group effort of collecting something to put him back together. It's also worth noting that his memories are likely gone. All this evidence in mind, what exactly is Shatter Victim? Shatter Victim is the theory that when the crying child dies, his soul essentially shatters. Or more accurately, his spiritual essence is spread amongst many things. Most importantly, the 4 main Freddy's animatronics and Golden Freddy. Furthermore, in order to allow the crying child to find peace and rest, those pieces would need to be gathered and collected to make his memory whole again. And I know that's a lot, but it's not unprecedented. Before I even go back to the evidence, it needs to be noted that throughout the FNAF games and books and even the movie, memory and spirits are tied inextricably together, almost to a point that in the FNAF universe, you could describe a ghost as a manifestation of that person's memories when they were alive. But some of the evidence we've gathered so far leans a lot into this theory. The idea that in both Happiest Day and FNAF World, whether or not this is just the same event in different perspectives or steps of this process, regardless, it features pieces being collected in order to allow the crying child to rest. Even in the Happiest Day, those pieces are the other missing child incident victims. But I hear you, we may have evidence on why this works to bring him back, but do we have any evidence to suggest that a spirit could shatter? Well, we do, a few times, in the books. In the Fazbear Frights epilogues, Andrew is a spirit who attaches himself to William Afton specifically to torture him forever and keep him alive because he hates William Afton that much. He's basically doing an ultimate custom night within Fazbear Frights. But in one of the stories, The Man in Room 1280, William Afton convinces a priest to wheel his barely alive charred body into a Fazbear warehouse. And once there, William's body just explodes over everything nearby, infecting it with his agony. And as Andrew tells Jake, Andrew's spirit as well. In the 4th epilogue, we get Andrew recounting this moment. And if we pull out some of the quotes from those pages, we get this. "I know I was in him when we got to this big place with lots of cool stuff. All I can remember after that is wanting to be everywhere. I can remember being all over the place and all kinds of things. And I remember this animatronic dog, Fetch. So I think I was in Fetch, sort of. I think that's how I got here. I don't know why I think that. I just do. I infected them. I remember now. I infected everything I threw my anger at." So it seems as though when this happened, Andrew's spirit split up and went into all of those objects along with Afton's agony. And Andrew seems to believe he directly infected some of these objects just with the anger he threw their way. Throughout the next few epilogues, we see Jake trying to collect those objects using Andrew's thoughts in order to retrieve them, at first just to make sure nobody gets hurt, but by the end of it to help Andrew move on. At some point before they're done, Jake almost begins to find peace and rest and move on, but Andrew begs him to stay, because while Jake might be able to move on at this point, Andrew says he can't. he is trapped. It takes them collecting all of the objects that Andrew's soul has been split into, throwing them into a trash compactor with themselves, and then in that moment, Andrew's spirit is able to find peace and rest, but he cannot move on until the parts of him have been collected. And if FNAF's recent Golden Freddy theory is anything to be believed, there's a good chance that Andrew is actually the parallel for the crying child, which makes this evidence even stronger. The idea of not being able to move on until your soul and memory have been repaired is actually a common theme in FNAF. We see one example of it in Alone Together, but we see a direct example of it in The Silver Eyes, a completely separate series of books. In the third book, The Fourth Closet, Carlton gets injected with Remnant directly to his heart and goes unconscious. And while he's unconscious, he's able to interact with the other spirits in the room, the missing child incident victims. At first, only seeing the victim who was put in the Golden Freddy suit, who tells him he's trying to collect their memories to put them back together. In the graphic novel, we see this visualization of these scattered pieces of paper floating around, and when Carlton helps to collect them and organize them into pictures, suddenly, missing child incident victims start popping out of thin air. And once all of these memories are collected, Carlton is able to get through to these victims, tell them what's really going on, and eventually allow them to find peace. But while their memories are scattered about, they are unable to. So, we know for a near fact that memory and spirits are inextricably tied in the FNAF universe, and it's pretty clear that memories need to be fixed before soul is allowed to move on. So then the question becomes, all that can be true, but how did the crying child spirit end up in the Freddy's animatronics if he died in Fredbear's Family Diner? Well, we do have one possibility for that given to us once again in The Silver Eyes. In the first book of this novel trilogy, also called The Silver Eyes, there's a conversation about the memories we leave behind when we're alive. And Charlie, our protagonist, mentions she doesn't believe in ghosts, but she does believe that memories can haunt a place. In that conversation, Marla then says this quote, "I don't know, sometimes I have little moments where it's like there's something I forgot, something I regret, or that I'm happy about, or something that makes me want to cry, but it's only there for a split second, then it's gone. Maybe we're all shedding our fear and regret and hope everywhere we go, and catching up traces of people we've never met. Maybe it's everywhere." Before the Bite of 83, Dave Afton is very clearly very close to the Freddy's characters. He calls them his friends, he remembers them after he dies, and it is notable that they're the things that show up in his unconscious state before he dies, but for some reason he's terrified of Fredbears, and I think it's safe to assume that Freddy's as well by the time of these minigames. So is it possible that after this fear starts, he starts to leave these terrified memories amongst all of the Freddy's animatronics that he's forced to spend times with? Suddenly, this shatter victim theory starts to form. And before we fully make it, I mentioned earlier that there was some new information that helps me further bolster this theory. And of course, it's the week before, because it's like the most important FNAF lore book ever released. But at some point in this book, you can punch in 1983 into the voicemail box, and if you do, you get an impossible recording of that day, where you can hear Michael picking on his brother, Dave begging them to stop. You can even hear, which we've never heard before, a staff member yelling at them to cut it out. And then we hear the crunch of the bite. And immediately after, Ralph, the phone guy who's listening in, gets bit by Freddy in a similar way. They both just say crunch. It's almost as if the crying child is haunting the entire establishment. An event that is not necessarily linked to the missing child incident is showing up in the voicemail box and compelling Freddy to almost recreate it in a way. Almost as if that infestation is felt strongest in the animatronics. If this theory is true, what is the story of Shatter Victim? Well, let's pop all of this evidence into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. In his life, Dave Afton loved the Freddy's characters and would play at the Freddy's location often, but then something happened that changed his perspective entirely. Whatever that something is unclear and is a theory for another day, but he saw something that made him terrified of these animatronics. But due to his brother looking after him since his father was never home, he was forced to still spend time around these very same animatronics. Throughout the rest of his life, his grief soaked into the very Freddy's animatronics that he used to love. Those characters are still his friends, but he couldn't bear the robots. And eventually, when the bullying comes to a head one day at Fredbear's, the Bite of 83 happened. His mind is crushed inside of Fredbear's jaw, and as his body putters out, he hears that Fredbear plushie reach out to him, promising that they'll put him back together. And it's in that moment of death where his soul begins fleeting to the anchors of memory placed throughout the establishment, the Freddy's animatronics. Much like Ennard himself said, there's a little bit of me in every body. There's a little bit of Dave in every bot. Scattered like this, although his presence and crying can be heard throughout the establishment, he cannot find peace in pieces. Rest is impossible. But then, a long time after, there's a glimmer of hope. The end of FNAF 6 sees a fire to all of the remaining animatronics that still exist, and they all melt into one congealed mass, finally laying to rest. And it's in that moment, much like the trash compactor of Fazbear Frights, where all the pieces have been gathered. It's in this moment that I believe FNAF World is created, likely by Charlotte, the spirit of the marionette, or possibly Cassidy, the spirit of Fredbear. This realm of sorts is more so a manifestation of the efforts of one of these spirits to seek out the pieces of Dave's memory still in the rubble, finally putting the crying child back together and creating his happiest day. And it's in this moment, the modified, repaired version of the memory of his death, that Dave Afton is finally in one piece again and is able to find peace and rest. And that's essentially it. Once again, I'm not the original creator of this theory, and my interpretation of it may not perfectly line up with theirs. Go and follow them if you're more interested in the theory. But the more I look into this theory, the more things start popping up that line up with it, and the more I like it. But what about you? Do you believe it? Security Breach Ruin came out and blew away effectively 99% of the fan base, and it reignited a passion in the fandom that was honestly a little needed. But one of the most intriguing parts about Ruin is the lore that it presented. New characters, new animatronics, even new protagonists, and Cassie. We don't get all that much information about her compared to other video game protagonists, but for FNAF standards, we honestly know a lot about her. Or do we, really? Slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what is the story of Cassie? At first, all we know is that she's a girl of a similar age to Gregory, and that she's friends with him enough to go to this scary abandoned pizzaplex to meet him. As the game goes on, we begin to learn more about her. When we pick up the Roxy talkie after hearing Gregory's voice, we learn that he's trapped under Roxy Raceway and that we agree to go find him. We also learn that Roxanne Wolf is Cassie's favorite character. Keep that in mind because it's important later on. Quickly after, we learn more about Cassie's family, namely her father. When we pick up the Faz Wrench, one of the main 3 items in the game, she remarks that it looks just like her dad's. Her dad? The Faz Wrench is an item described as being used by Faz technicians, so this implies that her father was a Faz technician at the Pizzaplex, if this one looks just like his. But that's not the only information about her father that affirms this detail. Later, when we get an AR Glam Bonnie plush, Cassie notes that her father never told her what happened to him. If her father knew what happened to him, he would have not only had to be part of the company, but pretty high up. Not only does this nearly confirm that he worked for the Pizzaplex, but he also worked here fairly recently. We're not talking about someone who used to work at the Pizzaplex but retired and is living with his daughter. Bonnie was put out of commission so quickly that although they did change most of the art in the Pizzaplex, they still didn't have an official corporate story to what happened to Bonnie. As of Security Breach, we can honestly assume that her father was most likely working there until at least Security Breach, which brings me to something else about her father. A lot of the information we get about him describes him in the past tense. Dad wouldn't tell me instead of dad won't tell me. My dad used to collect these instead of my dad collects these. Bonnie was my dad's favorite instead of Bonnie is my dad's favorite. The repeated use of the past tense makes me assume that her father is most likely dead, for who knows how long, but at least long enough that being reminded of him with the Faz Wrench didn't seem to upset her. And for a while, that's really all we get about Cassie. Honestly, that's all we get about her for the majority of the game. But then Roxy Raceway starts telling us more, starting with the Roxy Salon. We get a bunch of cardboard cutouts of Roxy hanging out with Cassie, having a great day, doing their makeup and things like that. We also get these 2 cardboard cutouts back to back of Gregory giving something to Cassie, and then Cassie in tears looking at Gregory's missing posters. It seems as though we're right to assume that Cassie really likes Roxy, although at this point we're not 100% sure why. We can also assume that this is part of the reason why Cassie is so willing to help Gregory. They are close friends if these images are to be believed. And then of course, the scene that gave a lot of us a lot of dread, shutting off Roxy right outside of the end of the game. However, when we encounter Roxy, she gives us a lot of information. She tells us that she remembers our special day, most likely a birthday party, and most likely our 11th birthday party. Now, she just says it was the 11th, so this could be a date, but the lack of a month suggests that it was our 11th birthday. And finally, she says, "I'm sure your friends will show up next time. Have you booked your party yet?" And suddenly, everything clicks. That's why Roxy is her favorite. That's why she's so willing to help Gregory this far in this dangerous mission. Cassie has no other friends. On her 11th birthday, she was completely alone. Her father didn't even show up. He might have already been dead by the time that happens. There's only one animatronic there, Roxy. She tries to have a fun day, bonding with Roxy, doing makeovers and everything like it, but it only helps so much. She's still sad and alone. Until Gregory, that is. He comes to her birthday and they become friends quickly. She's willing to go this far to save Gregory because he is her only friend. She has to save him, just like he saved her. After this admittedly rough moment, we go deeper down. We find the room keeping the thing in the basement locked away. Turning off Mexis and breaking down the wall, we encounter it. What we thought was Gregory. We encounter the Mimic. Roxy, somehow still alive, saves us apparently, for a time being. And Gregory, the real Gregory, gets a hold of us. He tells us that he's been trying to get a hold of us this whole time, which I am inclined to believe. After all, halfway through the game, there's a rare moment that only some people got. This jump scare.
Do you need assistance?
Bastard.
Do you need assistance?
No.
Do you need assistance?
Go away. Can occasionally be replaced with this.
Cassie, is that you? Gregory?
That feels like the real Gregory trying to get a hold of Cassie, to me anyway. He tells us to listen to his friend's instructions to get us to an elevator to escape. Once there, he lets us know more about Mexis, that it was created and designed to hide this thing in the basement. Then he switches tone, tells us that he's sorry but he has to make sure that we're not followed, and drops the elevator. Now, I have reasons to believe that Gregory isn't the one talking to us at the end of this ending, and instead the Mimic took back over, but that's a topic for another video. For now, we're focusing on Cassie, but is that it? What else could we possibly know about her? Well, I think there is more to her and her father, and the key to solving it, frankly, is through the premise of the game. Gregory never wanted Cassie to go to the Pizzaplex, so the initial message that she got from Gregory to meet at the Pizzaplex was fake. Okay, so then the Mimic sent that message. Well, therein lies the problem. How did the Mimic contact Cassie? Or why did he even think to contact her in the first place? Sure, the Mimic can learn Gregory's voice from the security logs throughout the Pizzaplex, but why would it know to contact Cassie? Or how could it even reach her? It has no service, no freedom, no money. The only thing it could do is something free and easy that supports someone, like subscribing to my new second channel, Rytus, that's launching 2 videos today. My wife and I's playthrough of Faith Chapter 1 and Part 1 of my Security Breach Ruin playthrough. Link right here. Thank you so much. It's highly edited content. It'll be variety. It'll be every week, and it's edited by the very talented Queen Coda. I'll see you there. But in all seriousness, all the Mimic could physically do is wander around the room that it's locked in. But if you look around the room we're adjacent to, putting on the Vanny mask, you'll see a bunch of destroyed security nodes lying around the floor. It was destroying its bonds while it was in its cage. That's why I think Gregory and Vanny cemented over the door. They knew it was already trying to break out. And specifically, I think Gregory and Vanessa are the ones that cemented him into that room specifically because of the Gregory backpack right outside the vent, right outside the room. But that's, again, theory for another day. Whatever locked it down here started placing security nodes all over the Pizzaplex to try to distance it from the ones it was already breaking, which means in some digital way it can reach into this room. And what do we have in this room? The machine that was created to contain it that presumably it can't directly interact with, and the console used to modify the machine, but it's a console nonetheless. So who would have used that console last? Well, let's step back and get a broader picture to see if we can answer that. A recurring theme in the duffel bag messages of Security Breach is that although she wasn't being sloppy, Vanny's shenanigans were starting to be noticed by several of the human staff. But right as a few of them were about to uncover something big, they were all called in to the all-staff meeting. Specifically, one that was after hours, cake was promised at, and that all service staff were required to go to. Now, a lot of people have theorized that although mass firing was already taking place because of the staff-bot success, this all-staff meeting was Vanny's way of tying up any loose ends, killing off people that would have otherwise uncovered what was really going on. Pretty much any service staff who would be poking around places they shouldn't be. Mainly people like janitors, kitchen workers, and technicians. Technicians just like Cassie's dad. Well, we know he's dead, but why would we assume that he was getting too close to Vanny? What could he have found? Why was he digging? The answers lie in Candy Cadet. Right before the ending of the game, we see Candy Cadet, who tells us a 5-part story. The story tells us about a mother and a son who live in a cabin in the woods. In the woods, there's a monster that the mother locks in the basement. Every night, the mother sings a lullaby to the son and then leaves. Eventually, the monster stops growling and instead learns the lullaby. It sings it once, the son goes to the door and opens it. The story ends there, but like, the monster kills the son. It's pretty straightforward. For a while, I was thinking that this story was detailing what Vanessa and Gregory do in between Security Breach and Ruin. They find the monster, trap it underground, and then eventually it learns to mimic the sun. But there's two problems with it. First off, Vanessa and Gregory aren't mother and son, they're just two people. Granted, that's not a huge issue because it is a story, so it's supposed to be a metaphor, but the real issue here is that in the story, the son is the one that was tricked by the lullaby. Meanwhile, Gregory isn't tricked. Cassie is the one that falls for it. But now I'm thinking that it wasn't about Vanessa and Gregory at all, but it was about a family. Okay, I think I've got it. Here's the real story of Cassie and her father. Mr. Cassie's dad worked at the Pizzaplex since its inception. Gifted with technology and a deep lover of the franchise, Bonnie was his favorite after all, he thought his talents could lend to the creation of something wonderful. And as a fast technician, it did. Okay, bye. He was able to work alongside the animatronic characters that he loved, and his daughter Cassie could stay at the daycare while he did it. It was hard for her to make friends, spending most of her time at the daycare of the Pizzaplex, but she understood that this was for the best. Besides, she did have a lot of fun at the daycare, and having a dad who worked at the Pizzaplex came with its benefits. She was able to ride the Foxy log flume, although it was never open to the public. But when Bonnie, her dad's favorite animatronic, seemed to disappear one day, he got a lot more focused on his work. She asked him what happened to Bonnie, but he refused to tell her. Truthfully, he wasn't too sure himself. Bonnie goes to Monty Gator Golf one night out of nowhere, and suddenly he turns up in the back of Bonnie Bowling, destroyed, surrounded by a smashed bowling ball. None of it made sense. Nothing added up. So he started snooping. He traced the electrical signals going from the animatronics, trying to figure out what was causing them to act erratically. Eventually, he found a current of electricity pooling underneath Roxy Raceway. The same current electricity that was causing all of these brownouts. Going even deeper, eventually he found it. The mimic, the creature underneath the Pizzaplex that's being locked away. He's confused and doesn't really understand what's going on, but between the mimic being there, the Mexus machine, and the console to use it, he starts to piece things together. As a fast technician, Mr. Cassie's dad would be pretty smart, and so he works on the Mexus unit, placing security nodes all over the basement and expanding its coverage. He begins placing security nodes throughout the facility, trying to cut off its access points. And to make sure no one messes with these security nodes, he creates sort of a digital watchdog that can tell when someone's trying to hack in. Once it finds that person, it simply summons a nearby animatronic. After all, most animatronics in the facility are programmed to be able to handle and safely extract any ne'er-do-wells. So what's the harm in having a distress signal? He styles this watchdog after his favorite animatronic, Bonnie. But before he can finally finish the entire system, he's called to the all-staff meeting. We cut to much later. The Mimic eventually is able to disable all of the nearby security nodes, but it still can't get out. There's security nodes that are just too far away and it can't reach. It needs a decoy. It needs someone else to deactivate those on its behalf so it can leave. leave, it once again digitally extends to the nearby room, and it finds the console. Not only that, it finds that someone was logged in to the console recently. Mr. Cassie's dad. Someone who would not only have credentials in the system, but a linked daughter in the system who stayed at the daycare. A daughter with contact information. Using the only voice it's been able to mimic, Gregory, it reaches out to that daughter, and luckily enough, she responds. I want to be very clear here. I don't think Mr. Cassie's dad was actually the one to build Mexus. The machine is incredibly rusted and aged. It's honestly the oldest looking thing in that room. I think somebody else entirely built Mexus, but it's someone we know. However, covering that is going to need to be its own video.
One of the most clowned on FNAF theories post-security breach was GregBot. The idea that this kid is secretly an animatronic. And sure, there is evidence to suggest it, but in Five Nights at Freddy's, there's enough vague evidence that you could make a decent argument for anything, however unlikely it might be. But in the big 2026, especially after Secret of the Mimic and Escape the Pizzaplex, was there any credit to this theory? Well, kinda. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So why did people think that? On the surface, the idea that Gregory, this human child, was a robot is almost laughable, but there is decent evidence to support this theory. Most of it centering around the fact that Gregory's just straight up weird. He's so weird as a character. His first introduction is him forgetting his name?
I'm Gregory.
As far as we're aware, he's got no family history. He's been at this Pizzaplex for God knows how long. He still remains outside, and when he does actually escape the Pizzaplex, he goes to a cardboard box instead of running home. But seemingly this child who lives at the Pizzaplex and doesn't have any family can hack really good and is super smart. Not to mention whenever Vanny gets too close to us, his eyes do this weird CRT filter flicker. Just as a character, he's strange, and other people react strange to him. Glamrock Freddy, after knowing this kid for 5 minutes, says, "You are broken," and brings him to a medical bay thing. That's a weird thing to say to a human being. And if he is a robot, we have evidence to suggest how that would make sense. The idea that Vanny was looking up realistic human masks, and the fact that there's a silo that seems to be dedicated to a robot learning how to act like a child. There is a lot of evidence for this theory. As far as what the theory actually specifically was, there's a lot of different interpretations, but most of them center around the idea generally that Glitchtrap was trying to in some way recreate the Afton family. And when looking at what to replace the crying child with, making a robotic version of a small child like the crying child worked. It was good enough. Hence the creation of a GregBot. But just before security breach happens, the moment before, Freddy and Gregory are somehow reset and freed from Glitchtrap's control. And now these two robots have to make the most sense out of what they've been dealt with. So how does Secret of the Mimic change this? Well, the wildest part of that game is its third secret ending, where theoretically, you could have reset M2 into behaving like David, the boy that M1 wanted the robot to be, Edwin Murray's late son. And it does this. It resets into a childlike size, acts like a child, walks over to the bed, kicks his feet, goes to bed. It's really cute. And this is a FNAF game directly showing us a major character robot acting like a small boy. If you throw a convincing enough skin suit onto that thing, it might be Gregory. Not to mention M2, the other major antagonist of this game, whose entire goal is specifically to make the Mimic act like a little boy again. So the entirety of Secret of the Mimic is giving credit to the idea that, well, Gregory could be a robot if it's the Mimic. But do we have any reason to believe that Gregory is the Mimic? Well, we have the GregBot reasons from before, and Security Breach Ruin came out, which gave us 1,000 reasons to believe that Gregory is the Mimic, and one reason that pretty much debunks it entirely. Now, similar to Secret of the Mimic, the entirety of Ruin sort of gives credence to the idea of a Gregory robot, like the entire game existing at all. After all, the point of the game is that the Mimic can nearly perfectly recreate Gregory's voice. And we find out that it's currently trapped under the Pizzaplex with Gregory's backpack right outside the room, left there. There's a very logical through line to this if the true ending to the security breach is us failing, getting caught by an animatronic or by Vanny, and not escaping the Pizzaplex. Or even the main exit of leaving out the front doors, only to be quickly collected by Vanny once we're outside. if we as Gregory are the Mimic, and one of these bad endings happen, then logically the rest of it follows suit. Vanny captures us, traps us underneath the Pizzaplex, and leaves us there. Then when everything starts falling apart, we're still stuck there. But we still can pretend to be Gregory, so we use that to lure Cassie to let the Mimic out again. The entirety of Ruin works so incredibly well into giving more evidence for Gregory being the Mimic, except for the ending, which outright disproves it. While the Mimic is actively fighting Roxy, Cassie gets a call on her walkie-talkie from Gregory, the real Gregory, who's apparently been trying to reach her this whole time. He didn't even tell her to go to the Pizzaplex. She's not supposed to be there. And frankly, I find it beyond belief that the Mimic could one hand fight off Roxy and in the other hand talk into the walkie-talkie, and we wouldn't even hear that, let alone he can do that. But even if you're skeptical and you think that the Mimic can pull that off, immediately after this, the Mimic throws a forklift, jumps down, and we see its full body and both empty hands. It doesn't have the walkie-talkie anymore, and yet Gregory continues to talk to us through it. So there is a real Gregory. Or at the very least, this is basically confirmation that there is a Gregory separate from the Mimic. You could technically make the argument that Gregory's still a robot, he's just not the Mimic, but it seems incredibly strange to me to have Gregory be a robot that isn't the Mimic in a game where the Mimic exists. Like, it's kind of like double dipping, you know? So if Gregory isn't the Mimic, what's the point of all this weirdness? How are they connected? Why are there so many connections between the Mimic and Gregory? Well, like many of us had suspected, Gregory isn't physically the Mimic, but his mind was controlled by it, like Vanny. And now we might know how. Any game that we see Glitch Trap in, whether it be Help Wanted, Security Breach, Ruin, Help Wanted 2, we see it have the ability to take over somebody's mind. Now, the specifics are never specified, but I tend to think that since the Mimic is Glitch Trap, very likely anyway, the way Glitch Trap takes over someone's mind is it iterates upon itself. It makes a copy of itself. Like M1 to M2, M2 to possibly M3 being Glitch Trap, and all that the Mimic is doing isn't necessarily mind controlling somebody, but making a copy of itself in their mind. After all, the mind is sort of a biological computer. So whether or not this would actually work, there's enough wishy-washy science that it works in this weird sci-fi paranormal story. So Vanny isn't Vanessa being mind controlled, but rather an iteration of Glitch Trap operating within Vanessa's mind. Now, the books have heavily suggested the same thing happened to Gregory before Security Breach. Stories like GGY and the full book Escape the Pizzaplex pretty much directly show us Gregory acting as though his mind is taken over by Glitch Trap. In GGY, he's killing therapists and anyone who looks into him, and Escape the Pizzaplex, he literally torments and tries to kill Cassie for an entire week, which if he's not being controlled by Glitch Trap is fucking crazy. Now, in the past when I've made the argument that Gregory was under the control of Glitch Trap, the how always sort of felt flat. Now, in VIP, we had an AR mask that had the Mimic inside of it, so I did make the argument that maybe that's how Gregory was turned, but there was never any evidence that Gregory ever used an AR or VR mask. It was sort of just an assumption, and that's where it sat. Until recently, I got a theory suggestion on my Patreon. Now, I collect questions for the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, the weekly podcast we have on this channel, both via email and on my Patreon. And recently, a patron by the username MooseGuys suggested this. I think it would make sense if Gregory got possessed by the Mimic 1 virus the same way as Vanessa/Vanny, through glitchy tapes. But where he differs is that it wasn't cassette tapes, but VHS tapes. I think this due to the teasers before Security Breach, the Freddy and Friends on tour. In them, we see glitches, and if you put all of them together, you see a picture of Glitch Trap. That's a huge parallel to Vanessa/Help Wanted gameplay, where you collect glitchy cassette tapes, and when you get more, the more you see Glitch Trap. Another point of minor evidence I like is Dawko's Steel Wool interview before Security Breach. When asked about the Freddy and Friends on Tour cartoons, he said that if you watch those, you're already playing Security Breach. If you look at it, you play as Gregory in Security Breach. So if you're already playing it when you watch them, the person watching should be Gregory too. What an interesting take that is. And it makes a lot of sense. Think of that one very strange line right near the end of a normal playthrough of Security Breach. While we're in the elevator to the main exit, Vanessa's talking over the intercom, and she says,
Gregory, I think you deserve a reward.
It's emphasized, it's focused on. Frankly, it's so out of place that many of us make jokes about it. Like, why does she say it like that? But what if the reason that line seems like it's emphasized is because it is? Because it's a callback to something that we didn't actually see in-game, but something Gregory experienced. What if that's the line Vanny used to lure Gregory into a room to watch the tapes? After all, there's one secret room we haven't talked about in Security Breach so far, and it's the retro CD sister location living room looking secret room. It's a strange room, one that seems inexplicably important to the lore, but never really explained why. After all, there's parts of this room that do make sense. We have the retro CDs that show us more about Vanessa while she was being taken controlled by Glitchtrap, and Patient 46, which, after GGY and Escape the Pizzaplex, I think it's fair to assume that Patient 46 is Gregory. So we have the origins of these two characters, we have the strange code on the wall, and all of this is incredibly lore relevant. But up until now, many of us just assumed that the TV playing Freddy and Friends on tour isn't lore relevant. What if it was? After all, if we were already playing the game as Gregory watching Freddy and Friends on tour, maybe this was where it happened. Maybe this was the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. Not only would this make sense, but it lines up with how the Mimic, as Glitchtrap, would collect a victim. If the Mimic is truly replicating what William did, well, William was one to lead a child into a back room and then kill them. But even though Glitchtrap isn't trying to kill Gregory, the same method applies. Picture it. Glitchtrap still needs a human boy to make this plan work, and as they keep scanning the different patrons of the Pizzaplex, Gregory gets noticed. This boy who spends countless days sneaking around the Pizzaplex, playing the arcade machines, he never seems to leave, and nobody's come to check up on him. He'd be the perfect victim. If he's been here this long, who would notice if he stayed? So eventually, Vanny catches him playing an arcade machine and approaches him. A brand new mascot suit Gregory doesn't recognize, and Vanny leans down and says, "Hey, you're really good at that. In fact, Gregory, I think you deserve a reward. You're one of our most loyal patrons and one of the best arcade players I've ever seen. You must be one of the biggest fans of Fazbear out there. How would you like to watch a rarely seen vintage cartoon? Simply follow me into this back room." Vanny then leads him to the secret sister location living room-like room and locks him in. Then he's left there in the dark, only able to watch the Freddy and Friends on Tour show, his mind slowly being taken over by Glitchtrap. It all makes perfect sense, and it leaves our three different likely victims of Glitchtrap's mind control, all with slightly different versions. Vanessa was captured using the cassette tapes, Gregory was captured using the VHS tapes, and Cassie was captured using the AR Vanny mask. So that's where I think Gregbot stands nowadays. I don't think Gregory was ever literally a robot or the Mimic, but I do think the Mimic iterated itself inside of his mind, much like Vanessa. And the idea that he did it through these VHS tapes makes a lot of sense. But let me know if I've gone absolutely crazy in the comments below.
We, as FNAF theorists and fans, make a lot of theories and speculation about Cassidy as a character. But for anyone not in the know or needs a refresher, that's kind of a who character? Like, what do you mean one of the most important characters in the lore of the franchise is never directly mentioned a single time in any of the games? Well, it's FNAF, so it's to be expected. But I thought it would be helpful to everyone, well-versed and just starting out, to make a video exactly like this one. Here's everything we know about Cassidy, why many people think they're the one behind Ultimate Custom Night, and why they might be the vengeful spirit. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a video. In June 2018, Scott Cawthon released Ultimate Custom Night as a sort of final thank you for the franchise and fandom around it. Obviously, this wasn't a final goodbye because Help Wanted came out not even a full year later, because, you know, this is the franchise with 7 final chapters in it. But before Ultimate Custom Night was out too
long, people figured out that this was a diegetic game. It was something that was happening in-universe. We, the player, are William Afton, going through an eternal punishment set up by some ethereal force, basically being forced to relive all of our worst memories thrown at us at all times. And while that was fairly apparent, the what of this game was never really heavily debated. It's the why, the how, those aspects that really hold arguments to this day in FNAF discourse. We know for a near fact that William Afton is being tortured for all of time in this Ultimate Custom Night. But the question is, who is doing this to him? Why are they doing it to him? And how are they doing it to him? Well, obviously plenty of people want to torture William Afton, but why this particular way? As far as the who, I really only know Baba O'Reilly, but the game itself does point a few directions as to who is doing this. We hear mention from a few death quotes about a quote, one you should not have killed. But one in particular is incredibly noteworthy. From Nightmare Freddy, I am remade, but not by you, by the one you should not have killed. So whoever this one is the one creating this purgatory. Pair that with other death quotes where we can hear a whispering voice behind an animatronic voice, this incredibly rare image of a face that can appear in the vent, and this audition listing for a quote vengeful spirit, and we have our mystery creator. Whoever this vengeful spirit is, they are both childlike, the one creating Ultimate Custom Night, and has a particular grudge against William Afton. But the final nail on the coffin for their identity is the ending cutscene of the game. Going back to some of those whispered death quotes, many of them focus on torturing William Afton forever, for the rest of time. And the final cutscene you can unlock in Ultimate Custom Night is a twitching Golden Freddy, slowly fading back into the distance, as if going on for the rest of time. So many people assume this vengeful spirit is the spirit inside of the Golden Freddy suit, who we have very little leads on. Either it's a child we have no information about, or it's the Crying Child. And everything we know about the Crying Child's characterization doesn't really scream vengeful spirit. It kind of just screams piss baby, or just screams in general. So the stall here is that it's likely a child possessing Golden Freddy and torturing William Afton for the rest of time. But can we get any more specific on who that spirit is? Well, when the game information begins to lack, that's when we pull on other media, like the books. One book in particular, the Security Logbook. This is, unironically, probably one of the most well-known non-game pieces of the FNAF franchise. I'd argue people know about this book more than they do about some of the, actual books. Because this is more of a workbook. This is an activity book. This isn't like a short story or a novel or anything. But somehow, this is so chock full of lore, it's nuts. It's so filled with lore that it's gaslit us into assuming every piece of merchandise has lore in it. Like when the coloring book came out, people were worried there'd be lore. Because if this had it, why not that? Very quickly after the Security Logbook released, people realized there were 3 voices in the book if you look at the text. There's the previous owner who writes in a red ink, there's faded text that can sometimes appear on the pages, and there's changed text, which appears very rarely near the end. The person writing in red ink's name is Mike, and judging from that and his opinions on the franchise, it's pretty safe to assume that Mike is Michael Afton. And he knows about Nightmare Fredbear. How many people in the franchise know about that? The person changing text in the book is often thought to be the Crying Child. After all, the things he says are very similar to the things we know the Crying Child has said. Lines like, I'm scared, I can't see, he's acting like a little crybaby. So probably the Crying Child. So the big question then was, who is the faded text? Mind you, this book came out in 2017, a few weeks after FNAF 6. So at this point, we thought we had the entire franchise under our belt, and nobody seemed to line up with this faded text. Well, throughout the entire book, the faded text kept repeating the words, my name. And using that and some changed page numbers, eventually the community had a set of paired numbers, and charting them on the word search gave us the name Cassidy. So if we assume the faded text, the one saying my name, is named Cassidy, the question then becomes, who the hell is Cassidy? This name isn't mentioned in any of the games. Well, whoever they are, they seem to be trying to help the Crying Child remember something. They seem to be dead by the fact that they put my name on a tombstone. It is ultimately up in the air as to who Cassidy might be, but the fact that this released a few weeks after FNAF 6, a game where we have a tombstone with a hidden name on it next to all the other MCI victims, and the fact that it came out a few months before UCN, many people, myself included, assume Cassidy to be the 5th missing child incident victim, the one inside of the Golden Freddy suit. It's also thematically relevant, the fact that in life the crying child was comforted by his Fredbear plushie, and in death the spirit of Fredbear is still trying to comfort him. Not to mention that since this book, the name Cassidy has only appeared in incredibly lore-relevant locations. It was changed very quickly after it was discovered, but it's still worth noting that originally, the sprite of the princess in Princess Quest was named Cassidy. It's also incredibly noteworthy that when Scott was listing the possible scripts for the FNAF 1 movie, one of them was codenamed Cassidy, and the description of that script was that it was way too lore dense, and while the really invested fans would have loved it, it's too confusing for the general public. So that's Scott indirectly stating that the name Cassidy is incredibly lore relevant. So I think it's safe to assume that Cassidy is the Golden Freddy spirit and the one speaking in this book. So if they are the Golden Freddy spirit, and this book was released between FNAF 6 and Ultimate Custom Night, I think it's safe to assume that that is the spirit, the one you should not have killed. The vengeful spirit, the one creating Ultimate Custom Night. But even if we have the who, we still don't have the how. How is it that Cassidy is able to reach into the mind of William Afton and torment him with his own memories? Well, that theory isn't mine, but I'll still share it because it's relevant. Fellow theorist Stormister noticed that Scraptrap's design might be purposefully like that, not just shitty in general. After all, he's not just deteriorated in FNAF 6. Things have been added to Scraptrap at this point. The theory states that FNAF 3 William Afton was desperately trying to repair the Springtrap suit after the FNAF 3 fire, and to do so he pulled on the only other suit with similar technology, Fredbear. After all, they're the two Springlock suits of Fredbear's Family Diner. But as we know, spirits in Five Nights at Freddy's seem particularly attached to the metal of their animatronics, so taking pieces of Fredbear, which is possessed by Cassidy, and affixing it onto himself could theoretically take parts of Cassidy's spirit and attach it to himself too. It would be in this moment that Cassidy's spirit becomes attached to William Afton. And as we know from the books, it's shown that people who have an aptitude for agony or an intense connection with somebody's mind is able to send that person into a living nightmare that they can't escape from using that person's memories. So whether or not Cassidy is apt with agony, just the connection alone is theoretically enough to trap William Afton in his own mind. But if that's the how, then we still aren't sure on the why. At least a better why. Sure, yes, Cassidy was killed by William Afton, but William Afton killed like 20 people. Is there a particular reason why Cassidy is more vengeful than any other victim? I think we have the information to imply this. A few times throughout this franchise, Golden Freddy is depicted adjacent to depictions of drowning. Notably, in FNAF AR, one of his costumes is being chained up and underwater, and most notably, in both Ultimate Custom Night and FNAF World, we walk the Fredbear sprite into a red lake, one of the endings being called the Drowning Ending. Not to mention, in Help Wanted, you can occasionally see Dreadbear exiting the Red Lake. So there are weirdly a lot of instances where Golden Freddy is mentioned around drowning in a red lake. Why could that be? Well, in the first FNAF novel, William Afton directly describes what it's like to die by Springlock, and in it, he mentions that the main reason people die is drowning in their own blood due to the puncture wounds the Springlocks give you. And how apt of an allegory is drowning in a red lake to drowning in your own blood? Pair all of this with the fact that Golden Freddy is a Springlock suit of Fredbear, and I think we've cracked it. Keeping in mind that most of the evidence we've described so far is just straight fact with a little speculation on top. Let's throw all our ingredients into the oven and start heavily speculating on the building blocks we've made. The 5th victim of the missing child incident, Cassidy, was not killed like the previous 4. They were killed and then later stuffed into animatronic suits. But Cassidy was put alive in the chest of the Fredbear Springlock suit. And once trapped inside, the Springlocks were triggered, killing Cassidy in one of the most brutal and agonizing ways that this franchise can think of, drowning them in their own blood. A particularly heinous way to go, one that is uniquely agonizing and has now created an immortal enemy in their spirit. But for now, all Cassidy could do about it was ruminate and brood and threaten anybody who got too close to the Golden Freddy suit. They were trapped in that immovable suit, but eventually William's own desperation made him make his biggest mistake. In seeking out spare parts to repair himself, he found that Fredbear suit, took parts of it, and added it to himself. In doing so, bringing Cassidy's spirit over. All Cassidy had to do was lay in wait for William Afton's weakest moment to fully overtake him, and it wouldn't be too much longer until that opportunity arose, when his old business partner Henry Emily trapped and incinerated him, trying to have everybody move on. But it was in that moment, where William Afton's spirit was its weakest, about to move on, that Cassidy struck, entering his mind, using his own memories against him, and giving him that very same torture he gave to others right back to him. They knew moving on was too good for William Afton. He needed to suffer for as long as they could keep him, technically keeping his mind and spirit in our world, but only to suffer for as long as they could manage it. So that's Cassidy. Now, to be clear, I'm not an end-all be-all, and I don't decide what is true and isn't true. I tried to stay mostly factual before the pitch, but obviously you need to make some speculation to talk about anything with Five Nights at Freddy's. This is all still my opinion, but I tried to list all of the relevant evidence we have of Cassidy in this video.